welcome to Watch Symposium. I'm Austin. Is this the forthcoming 2023 Milgauss? No, it's not. But thanks for clicking on my video. That's what we're talking about. The Milgauss that I think we can expect this year in 2023. And what this is just a mock-up that came out on the Rolex forum a few years back. And it's a beautiful mock-up, and I love it. And I think if Rolex revamped the Milgauss to look something like this, it would take it from a marginally successful and popular watch, where it is now, up there with the Submariners and the GMTs, and I think people would like it and clamor for it just about as much as those models. And the interesting aspect of this mock-up is it borrows different elements from the Milgauss's pretty weird, aesthetically speaking, past. It's had somewhat of an identity crisis over the years, and I think Rolex has settled on the aesthetic. But like this model, it started out with a rotating bezel and the lightning second hand. And in the 1970s, it lost the rotating bezel, it got Dauphine hands that were kind of clipped at the end, and it lost the lightning second hand in favor of arguably an equally unique straight second hand with a red tip. And then we come to the way it looks today. And this is the aesthetic I think that Rolex has settled on, and that's what we're going to get going forward. All right, before we get into the predictions, let's talk about some technology that we can expect at some point. Maybe not this time around, but eventually. And the first is something I mentioned in another video, link in the description, but color shifting dials and blockchain technology. And apparently those are for security reasons. And, you know, when you imagine a color shifting dial, I mean, wow. It probably sounds cooler than it really is. I imagine like an explosion of color on the dial. But again, I think these are more things that we might not really visually notice, but that are implementations to counter counterfeit watches. So will it happen this time around? Probably not. But again, it's just something that apparently is on the way. Now, something we definitely know is on the way is the siloxy hairspring. All of the watches that most of my viewers like and I like are the professional watches. And those big watches have the blue parachrome hairspring, which I mentioned in my last video when we were talking about the 3186 movement. But they have an even better hairspring apparently, and that's the siloxy hairspring. And you can only find it on the smaller women's watches. Now, why? Are they testing it out on the women's watches? Perhaps. From what I gather, women wear their watches harder than men. So if the siloxy hairspring can manage the way a woman wears her watch, perhaps us guys will be just fine. But we've never seen it on the bigger watches. Does it have to do with the movement, and does it only work with the smaller movements? I don't think so. Or is Rolex just keeping it in their back pocket for the future when they need to give us something, but they kind of run out of ideas? So, you know, we'll just leave them with the blue parachrome spring is fine for now, and we'll implement this bit of technology when we need to. So keep that in mind. Now, when it comes to the Milgauss, think about the upgrades in terms of aesthetics and internals. Let's talk internals first. It's definitely going to get a new movement. And I have to say one thing about the aesthetics, it's going to get that little crown at the 6 to symbolize that. But it's got the 31 movement right now, and so it's going to get a 32 movement. Now, the biggest question with the Milgauss, by far, is will it have the Faraday cage or not? And this is such an interesting question because Rolex is really damned if they do and damned if they don't. If they don't have it, it's odd because that's a defining characteristic of the Milgauss. The whole point of the Milgauss is it's an anti-magnetic watch, and it always incorporated that Faraday cage. But apparently the new movements don't need any help with the anti-magnetism, all right? Because the Air King, which was released, used to have the Faraday cage, but lost it. And Rolex basically said it doesn't need it anymore. And so if they don't have the Faraday cage on the new Milgauss, how does that differentiate the Milgauss from the other watches? It really doesn't. And, you know, the whole point of the Milgauss is this is basically more anti-magnetic than the other watches in the catalog. And if it doesn't have that Faraday cage, then that really doesn't separate it. Now, of course, it's got sort of a legacy there, and you got the aesthetics. But to have nothing unique in terms of the internals that separate it, I think would be very odd. But if they do have the Faraday cage, it's going to keep the weight a little heavier. It's going to add the thickness to it. And it could just be gratuitous. And so would they do that if it's not needed? So it's a big decision on their part. And I cannot wait to see how they deal with that. Because basically with the Air King that lost the Faraday cage, they said, we don't need it anymore. And so again, what is the new Milgauss going to have? So that's the big question. Now, would the siloxy hairspring come into play? Because if they put the siloxy hairspring in the Milgauss, it would drastically differentiate it from the Air King and pretty much all the other watches. I don't know if the siloxy hairspring is more or less anti-magnetic than the blue parachrome hairspring, but again, it would introduce a unique internal aspect that again separates it from any of the other 32 movements. All right, let's talk about aesthetics. And of course, we're going to see a cornet down by the 6 to indicate it's got a new movement. But what other aesthetic changes do I expect? None. All right, none. Okay. Oh, hold on. There might be a little one, but why? Well, Rolex is in an interesting place right now because they have to give us something every year, but they don't need to change anything. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. And every one of their watches is selling out, at least here in Japan. And so they probably want to keep the visual updates to a minimum for a couple reasons. Number one, they don't need to. And number two, they don't want the Hulk phenomenon to happen. What is that? Well, think of the Hulk. It was popular before it was discontinued, and after it was discontinued, even more popular. People thought it was the end of an era, the last green Submariner you'd ever see, and it took some of the wind out of the sails of the Cermet. And Rolex doesn't want to do that. Now, there are kind of some exceptions, but they're more tweaks than anything. For example, the Explorer when it went from 39 to 36, or when the Air King got crown guards. But for the most part, you don't see big visual changes. And I think Rolex really probably resists doing that because they don't want the Hulk phenomenon to happen. Think about the Explorer too. We got the internal upgrade, but aesthetically it didn't change at all. And if you had gone out and you speculated on the 116570, thinking it was going to come out with a ceramic bezel and that it would be the end of an era and that those metal bezeled Explorer 2s would shoot up, oh man, you didn't do well because it looks the same. And when there's not a visual change, then the people who have it probably want the newer version, and the people who haven't gotten it yet want the newer version. I mean, all else being equal, then you want the latest and greatest technology. And so for that reason, I don't think Rolex is going to visually change the Milgauss. Now, they do have a habit of killing off the unpopular versions. If we don't appreciate it, Rolex takes it away from us. Case in point, the 116710 LN. We didn't appreciate it. It was sort of well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't like a lemon, but yeah, I mean, it didn't get the love for sure. They took it away from us, all right? And I think they'll do the same with the black dial version. We love the blue dial version. We appreciate it, but the black dial version just doesn't get the love. They're going to take that away, I think, and perhaps give us a different dial color. Now, would it be white? I don't think so because they use the GV glass, and I think it would just give that white a green tint that just doesn't work as well. Although it could. but I foresee another dial color coming, and then getting rid of the unappreciated black dial version. So maybe Rolex is going to come out with a different dial color, keep the blue, and get rid of the less popular black, which of course initially will shoot up. Gray market dealers will put a crazy premium, but it'll come down pretty damn fast, faster than the 116710 LN. So I wouldn't be speculating on that black dial if I was looking to make money, unless you sold it at just the right time. But again, we don't know that they're going to change anything. All right, and then we get to a possible tweak, the crown guards. All right, so the modern Milgauss doesn't have crown guards. The new Air King does, and those models, there's a lot of, there's a relationship between those models. I don't know if it's us that have figured that out or Rolex that pushes it. They've shared the same movement in the past. And so would crown guards on the new Milgauss make sense? It would be a little tweak. It would visually change it, and it would make a lot of sense. I mean, that is a watch for scientists, and as they're bumbling around in the laboratory, those crown guards could be as useful as the crown guards are on the Air King when the pilots are, banging the watch against the control panel or whatever, right? So it kind of makes sense, but I wouldn't be surprised if they don't do that, because I think they really like to keep their watches separate. And my guess is they don't like that sort of parallel that's always been drawn between the Air King and the Milgauss. And so for that reason, I think they didn't release them the same year. And I don't think the Milgauss will have the crown guards. I think that's sort of a characteristic of the Air King that I think makes it unique. So there you go. I don't think it's going to visually change much. You're going to get the little coronet at the 6 and maybe lose the less popular black dial in favor of a newer dial color, which will be incredibly popular and probably, at least for a little while, surpass the blue dial versions. And I think the biggest change is going to be with the movement. And again, there's that question. What will they do about the Faraday cage? And how will they handle that? Will they not have a Faraday cage? And if so, it's not much different than an Oyster Perpetual. Or will they have the Faraday cage? And if they do, how will they justify it? I mean, they said it was kind of obsolete and gratuitous. And how will you justify a thicker, heavier watch if you already said that the Air King didn't need it and it's already anti-magnetic enough? So how will they parse that? That's the most interesting question. I can't wait to see how they answer that. Let me know what you think. Do you agree with my predictions? What do you think the future of the Milgauss is? A lot of people think they're going to discontinue the watch. Absolutely not. They love the sciences. They support the sciences. The Milgauss is going to stick around, but in what capacity? That's the question. Let me know what you think. Take care. Thanks for watching. See you next time.